If you've ever heard the term tenant improvement allowance and you thought, oh, free money from the landlord, you wouldn't be alone in that thought, but it's also a lot more complicated than that. Welcome back to Small Business CRE, Episode 9. Talk today about tenant improvement allowances when you're leasing commercial space. How do you ask for one? How do you get them? And how do they work? Let's get into it. So first off, what we're going to cover, what a TI allowance actually is and why landlords offer them, how the money is actually handled, when it's appropriate to ask for one and when it's really not, how you run the numbers, and then also what needs to be in writing before you sign that lease and that tenant improvement allowance agreement. So who am I? My name is Dan Logan. I'm a commercial real estate agent working with small business owners in my local market. I've helped over 100 small business owners navigate these types of questions. And so hopefully some of this will be helpful for you today. So a TI allowance or a tenant improvement allowance, it's not just free money. From the landlord's perspective, what it is it's an investment that they're making back into their own building, essentially, by helping you with your build out. So whatever is done during that build out, there's a permanent improvement to the property that stays as property of the landlord. So essentially that TI allowance, they're funding the build out of their own building is what it is. Usually this would be a space that needs it anyways. And so that's why a landlord generally offers it. And kind of how that works from the tenant's perspective, it's a lower startup cost for them. If it's a newer business or a new small business owner, they might not have the capital up front they need to invest into an expensive build out or equipment or putting up offices or whatever it might be. And so it makes it possible in the first place for them to lease the space. And they can keep their operating capital to start the business versus paying for a costly build out. From the landlord's perspective, it helps them secure a tenant faster because of that very reason. But then it also is improving their own building. So they're just investing back into their own building and they're securing a tenant for it who's going to pay them rent at the same time. And that's how they recover their investment is through the rent, ideally through a higher rent than they would have gotten if they hadn't offered that tenant improvement allowance. And so therefore they're increasing the value of their building. So they're securing a tenant and they're investing back into their own property is the landlord's perspective as far as why they would offer a TI allowance. Now, how that usually gets handled, it can be handled any number of different ways. It's all negotiable. But generally speaking, a landlord is not just going to write you a blank check and say, all right, spend this and improve my space. There's going to be a lot more control over that. And so generally speaking, a tenant's going to hire a contractor, to plan out the space and do drawings and get permits to the city and all that kind of stuff. And then the landlord has offered to pay a certain portion of that cost, but usually a tenant is covering that upfront cost with the contractor. Most commonly, a contractor is working on behalf of the tenant. The landlord is just offering to pay back some of that cost. It can be done differently. The landlord could be doing it, but that's what I've seen most of the time anyways. So then once that work is completed and the certificate of occupancy is issued, oftentimes that is the triggering point for the landlord to pay that TI allowance. Like if a landlord gives you that check outright, just upfront, what if you just bail and you go cash the check and you don't do anything to the space? Or what if instead of doing all the build out you said you were going to do, you only do a portion of it, you only improve so much of the space, and then you pocket the rest of the money. So, or the work isn't completed. Like any number of things can go wrong. And so that's why most commonly a landlord will wait until a set point. Getting the certificate of occupancy is the most defined point as to when they'll actually pay their portion of that build out cost, the TI allowance. If a build out costs more than what the allowance is, then you're paying that difference is how that would work. So when is it appropriate to ask for a TI allowance and when is it just not appropriate? The most common use of a TI allowance are for newer buildings that are still like gray or vanilla shell condition. So if it's a new building, a landlord or developer will oftentimes build it out to just kind of a vanilla shell, just kind of a blank slate. And then they'll offer a TI allowance for the tenant to come in and build it out the way they want. So it's a vanilla shell, so it's probably concrete floors, all the HVAC electrical is done, or at least a basic package is done. The drywall is probably up, it's probably ready for paint, but probably hasn't painted yet. And then a tenant comes in and they use that TI allowance to fund that build out. Another time where it could be needed is if it's an older space, an old building that just the landlord agrees it needs renovated, they might offer a TI allowance in that case for you to come in, move some walls, do new carpet, do new paint, whatever it might be. When it's not appropriate is if it's a move-in ready space. If it's a space that most businesses could just move into tomorrow and it's ready, why would the landlord offer you a TI allowance? If it's just minor cosmetic changes that need to be made, or if it's a short-term lease. If you're trying to lease a space for only 1 year or even like 3 years, there's just not enough time there for a landlord to recoup that tenant improvement allowance. They want to see a longer-term commitment. So if you're going trying to lease a space for probably anything 3 years or under, you're probably not going to get offered or any kind of TI allowance. So what you should really do, and what I always recommend my clients do, is just run the numbers. I know you're the tenant, and you're trying to negotiate the best deal for you, but run the numbers and look at it from the landlord's perspective, and just see, does it even make sense? So in this example, if we got a 4,000 square foot space, and you're asking for a $10 square foot tenant improvement allowance, that's $40,000 that you're asking for. And so if you ask for a $40,000 TI, and that's, in my scenario, that's what the rent is. It's $10 a square foot, and you're asking for $10 a square foot. Then you're asking the landlord to pay you $40,000 upfront, which is equal to an entire year of your lease. So if you sign this lease, the landlord agrees to $40,000 in TI, and they pay you that upfront, it takes an entire year for you to pay back that TI. So the landlord doesn't even get any rent technically until year 2. And so, but if it's a 5-year lease, the landlord's looking at it as, well, it's a $200,000 total. They're filling a space. That might be worth it. And a lot of landlords would agree to that. But again, if you were leasing the space for a year, 2 years, 3 years, suddenly the landlord's not making very much of their money back. Or if you're asking for a $20 square foot TI allowance, now you're asking for 2 years of rent essentially. So it just doesn't make sense at a certain point. And so you should run those numbers and be realistic of what can a landlord even reasonably offer if they wanted to for it still to make sense for them, for it still to pencil. So yeah, if you're asking for a TI allowance that's equal to 2 to 3 years of the total rent, that's just not going to make sense to the landlord, and they're going to turn it down, even if they want to help you out. So just run those numbers beforehand. Okay, negotiation strategy. So the other reason that a landlord might offer TI, or like if you're going into a space that you want to renovate, the landlord isn't offering a TI if you want to ask for one strategy is offer to pay a higher rent in exchange for the landlord paying you that lump sum up front. So if you need to kind of preserve your capital for the time being to run your business, but maybe you can afford to pay an extra $2 to $3 a square foot in rent each month, that might be worth it. And the landlord will give you whatever, $20,000, $25,000 up front if you'll agree to $2 more a square foot in rent. Because not only does the landlord get more monthly rent, that higher rent also increases the value of their property, because commercial real estate is valued based on the income it's producing. So if you're paying higher rent, the landlord's property value actually goes up. So this is a way, again, just be realistic here and consider from the landlord's perspective and try to find a win-win situation. So if you want to try and negotiate a higher TI allowance, and if you're just not having any luck, try to offer to pay a higher rent if you can afford it. And that's the way that the numbers can actually work for both sides. Again, yeah, longer lease terms, you need more room. A 1 or 2 year lease, you're not getting a TI allowance, there's just really no scenario where that would work. 3 years, maybe, but it's just there's not much time there for the landlord to recoup their costs. 5 years is where you generally see TI allowances start getting the offers. Is right at that 5-year mark. You're in a good spot there. Another tool you can try to use, another lever you can try to pull, is try to offer a longer lease term. Offer a 7-year, offer a 10-year lease term. If you're comfortable with it. If you're asking for a large TI allowance, a landlord might consider it. Okay. The other thing that needs to be really clarified is when you are signing that lease, there will probably be a section talking about the TI allowance or the build out or the scope of work or some section really outlining how this is going to be done. You want to have this written out in as detail as possible, specifically around the timing of everything. So the timing and the dollar amount, obviously, you want to know how much the landlord contributed, what dollar per square foot or what's the total amount. Don't leave it vague. Make it very clear what are they willing to contribute, what it can be used for. If there's leftover, can you use it for equipment? If you're a restaurant, can you use some of that TI allowance to pay for your kitchen equipment? I don't know. It needs to be in the lease as far as what you can use it for, or if you only use it for, fixing up the space. Who controls the build out? This is kind of where I started. Usually the tenant will control the build out, but sometimes the landlord does. But who's responsible for managing that contractor and approving the cost of everything? Because that TI allowance will only go so far. When does the money get paid? Again, this is probably going to happen at the certificate of occupancy, but maybe it's when upon substantial completion or a certain checkpoint with the contractor. Like just outline when does the or maybe it's upfront, which is not very often, but when is the landlord actually going to pay you that tenant improvement allowance? And remember, you probably are on the hook for that upfront payment with the contractor. What happens if costs go over? Again, usually a landlord's agreeing to a set TI allowance, and anything over that's on you. But make sure it's clear what does happen. And then, of course, remedies if either party defaults or more so just timeline. Like what happens if your construction runs 2 months longer, or what happens if the landlord doesn't get you the information you need, and so that delays your construction. Like just have some remedies for both parties for if one of them doesn't perform or if timing is messed up, through no fault or through the fault of the other party. Just have all this in writing beforehand as a part of the lease agreement. So bottom line, TI allowance is a very useful tool to help a tenant get into a space that needs work done, but it's not free money. You shouldn't think about it that way as a tenant. It's an investment from the landlord into their own property, but they're not just trying to write you a check for free money, and you shouldn't think of it that way. Be realistic. Make sure you negotiate it up front as a part of the letter of intent process. Run the numbers for both sides and just understand what it looks like from the landlord's perspective. And then make sure you get it all detailed within the lease agreement. Have an attorney help you, have your broker help you, run those numbers really closely and make sure you understand exactly the timing, who's paying what, who's responsible for what, when does it happen. Iron all of that out before you sign that lease, because then you're committed. All right, thanks for watching. If you want a free PDF down below, the top 5 mistakes I see small business owners make when leasing commercial real estate. Until next time, good luck out there.